Welcome to Press Bonanza. In this series, we delve into pivotal moments in history, starting from 1950, a key year marking the intensification of the war on organized crime. This journey begins with the aftermath of Benjamin Siegel's death, when the Mafia's covert operations began to unravel significantly. In our first series on this channel, we explored a groundbreaking Time magazine article featuring Frank Costello, which marked a significant moment as it was the first major expose on organized crime. This article, which included dismissive quotes from FBI agents about the existence of organized crime in America, set the stage for subsequent explorations into this hidden world. Over the course of several episodes, we've examined various influential magazines like Life, Time, Look, the Saturday Evening Post, and the Sunday Times. Each publication peeled back layers of secretive stories, such as the Vegas skim and Mafia operations in the Bahamas, revealing hidden facets of organized crime. In this new series, we shift our focus from magazines to newspaper articles released from 1950 through the mid-1960s. Newspapers offer a different perspective, often presenting immediate reactions to events, which can include inaccuracies or sensationalism. For instance, the assassination of Anastasia in 1957 and the shooting of Costello were watershed events widely covered by the press. By examining every press article from this era, we aim to provide a comprehensive view of the organized crime landscape as reported in real time. This extensive review will not only cover prominent figures like Carlos Marcello, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Zerilli, the Campisi family, the Trafficante family, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo and his brother Capone and his relatives Joe Profaci and Joe Bonanno, but will also touch on less prominent mobsters, merely mentioned in various articles. This approach allows us to piece together a more nuanced history of organized crime, exploring both major events and the subtler dynamics within different families, including those in Detroit, New Orleans, and beyond. By using press articles as our primary sources, we can reconstruct the narrative of organized crime from 1950 onward, giving you a detailed look at how these events were documented and discussed in the media at the time. The structure of this new documentary series will differ from my previous work, offering a straightforward chronological exploration of press articles from the 1950s to the mid-1960s. Each episode will begin with a brief introduction to set the context, followed immediately by a dive into the press coverage of that month. This format will provide viewers with a month-by-month snapshot of the evolving landscape of organized crime, offering a direct line through the tumultuous period. Some crime families, especially those as secretive as Detroit's during the 1950s, rarely made the newspapers. Joe the Boss Zerilli, for instance, was so adept at avoiding the spotlight that over a decade, only about 10 articles mentioned him, an average of just one article per year. This all changed dramatically in October 1963, a pivotal moment when Joe Valachi broke the code of silence and identified key mob bosses across America during his testimony before Congress. Suddenly, even the elusive big boss of Detroit could no longer hide in the shadows. He was publicly named as one of America's major mob figures. As we progress through the series, viewers will witness this dramatic shift in press coverage. The series aims to not only document the stark increase in media attention, but also to illustrate how the exposure impacted the operations and secrecy of these criminal organizations. As we navigate through this series, you'll notice some articles may appear repetitive since they are sourced from various states and cities. Despite this repetition, each article holds unique, intricate details omitted in others. This approach allows us to piece together a more complete and nuanced picture of organized crime across different regions. We're committed to providing a comprehensive month-by-month analysis, ensuring even the subtlest pieces of information are not overlooked. This method will help us uncover the broader narrative of organized crime in America, highlighting both its widespread influence and regional peculiarities. Join us as we unravel the complex tapestry of organized crime through the lens of contemporary press coverage, article by article. Throughout the early 20th century, organized crime established deep roots across the United States, shaping political and economic landscapes in ways both visible and hidden. This article delves into the key figures and networks that dominated the underworld, from the notorious Costello, Rica, and Capone combined, to the sprawling influence of regional mobs in cities like New York, Chicago, Kansas City, and beyond. With law enforcement either complacent or complicit, these syndicates funneled hundreds of millions of dollars away from legitimate businesses, leveraging their power to control gambling, labor unions, and political offices across the country. What follows is an in-depth look at how these figures operated, the extent of their influence, and the far-reaching impact of their criminal enterprises. As early as 1932, these men, brass hats of the national racket network, were closely connected. This picture proves it. On April 20th, 1932, Chicago police arrested these men whom they had been watching outside a Chicago hotel. Paul the Waiter, Rica, kingpin of Chicago's mob dom. Sylvester Agoglia, gun-toter with arrests in Miami in 1930 and in Brooklyn, New York in 1920. Charles Lucky Luciano, New York hoodlum since then, deported to Italy. Meyer Lansky, henchman of Frank Costello, the Mr. Big of the national underworld. Rocco Fischetti, alias John Cena, cousin of the late Al Capone, and still a boss in Chicago Rackets. The Chicago mob bombed out legitimate businesses, funneling off hundreds of millions of dollars from gambling and other rackets. The Costello, Rica, and Capone combine, dominating the eastern region, reaches out to New Orleans, Miami, and Las Vegas, all under the shadow of the legendary Mafia. Newspapermen from a dozen major cities, wise in the devious ways of the racketeers, met in Chicago to exchange information. Within 24 hours, word of their meeting had spread across the country via the underworld grapevine. This is the first of 2 articles based on the newspaper's combined resources. This is a story about the rackets, chief among them, gambling, which funnels hundreds of millions of dollars each year from legitimate business channels. This story hits only the high spots. There's Frank Costello of New York, a figure so unbelievable he might have been dreamed up by a Hollywood scriptwriter. There are connections, sometimes clear, between Costello, Rica, and Capone, reaching the hoodlum setups in New Orleans, Los Angeles, with the likes of Mickey Cohen, and fields in Florida, Arizona, and Nevada. This loosely knit federation blankets the country. A gunman from Pueblo, Colorado, might take care of a recalcitrant mobster in St. Louis, while an expert at rigging slot machines can be flown in from Chicago at a moment's notice. In some cities, there is police and political complacency. In others, there is active police connivance. Gambling cannot operate for long unless the police allow it, and the same goes for other rackets. City after city sees the same quest for political power by the mob or their associates. The Continental Press Service, which peddles racing information nationwide, is one of their tools. A more detailed story will follow tomorrow. Lazia, the Kansas City gang boss, was shot to death on July 10, 1934. One of his pallbearers was Charles Binaggio, then just 25. Binaggio later wrested control of half a dozen wards from Jim Pendergast. President Truman, still smiling on Pendergast, received him at the White House. But Bill Boyle, Democratic National Committeeman, attended a Binaggio dinner. Binaggio was early on the bandwagon that led to the election of Governor Forrest Smith in Missouri Democratic circles. A few years ago, Kansas City was hailed for cleaning house, dismissing Pendergast's influence. Yet when Tom Pendergast, after serving a prison sentence for income tax fraud, bequeathed his Kansas City political machine to his nephew Jim, Kansas City remained a key political hub. Of course, this is President Truman's home turf, and what happens in Kansas City politically could have national repercussions. It has happened. Charles Bernardio, at 41, is the new Democratic political boss by reason of his organization and primary victories. Born in Texas, Bernardio grew up in the Rackets under John Lazia. Observers say he is second only to the governor in Missouri Democratic circles. Charles Bernardio has ties to the mob, particularly the Capone syndicate. Despite his claims, he does get a 25% cut from the Duke Sales Company, which sells Canadian Ace beer from Alex Greenberg's Chicago brewery. Greenberg was long the Ricca and Capone mob's financial mastermind. Bernardio's lieutenant, Tony Gizzo, played a key role in keeping the Ricca gangsters' families intact during their prison stints, even organizing a party upon their parole. There's Abner Longy Zwillman, boss of the New Jersey Rackets and a Costello ally. Pete Licavoli, once a St. Louis torpedo, now a gang boss in Detroit, breeds horses but keeps close ties to hoods across the country. Their influence is vast, from Detroit to Miami, and their operations continue despite periodic law enforcement actions. Mickey Cohen's private telephone directory alone provided a glimpse into the sprawling connections between Hollywood, sports stars, and racketeers. Even after attempts at reform, the mob retains a sinister presence in cities like Chicago, New York, and Kansas City. In a famous case, Frank Costello was named by Willie Beoff as being in cahoots with the Chicago mob. This was part of the deal that put Beoff and George Brown at the head of the Motion Picture Operators Union, leading to the $1 million movie Shakedown and the conviction of Ricca. The story is vast, and the names involved, Paul Ricca, Tony Gizzo, Charles Bernardio, and others, only scratch the surface of this vast criminal empire. In the post-war years, organized crime syndicates continued to evolve, finding new and creative ways to funnel illicit money across state lines. At the center of one such racket was Frank Costello, the notorious head of the national underworld. This article reveals how Costello, along with his criminal allies, masterminded a lucrative sweepstakes lottery that brought in millions of dollars a month. Centered in Providence, Rhode Island, and stretching across several eastern states, the operation was eventually compromised by law enforcement, though not before the mobsters had stashed away significant profits and set their sights on even more ambitious ventures, including a racetrack in Tel Aviv, Israel. Here is some inside information for Attorney General Howard McGrath, who meets tomorrow in Washington with mayors and other officials from major cities to discuss what can be done to fight the nationwide racket federation. This information involves the Continental Press Service, which supplies racing information that ultimately reaches the nation's handbooks. The Chicago, Ricca and Capone syndicate once waged war against Continental. James Reagan, Sr., boss of Continental, died of gunshot wounds and complications. The syndicate has long followed the adage, end them or join them. The syndicate has now halted its fight against Continental. The late Mont Tennes, a Chicago gambler, originated the idea for the wire service, which eventually passed into the hands of Moses Annenberg, a Philadelphia publisher, with James Reagan as the general manager. Annenberg, Reagan, and some others ran afoul of income tax laws and were found guilty. Annenberg went to prison, and Reagan won probation. Annenberg has since passed away, and both he and Reagan retired from the racing service business. Senator Daniel Serritella and others were also identified as part of the Muscle Party, trying to pressure Reagan. In 1948, Reagan gave a statement to the authorities in which he named Frank Costello of New York, Paul, the waiter, Ricca, and Senator Daniel Serritella as part of the syndicate. Reagan, in an effort to maintain his position, sold out to Reagan Jr. and brought in Arthur McBride to share in the business. After the death of Reagan Sr., his son wanted to leave Continental, so McBride acquired the property as the sole owner. He plans to take over management after graduating from the University of Miami. The Trans-American News Service, reputedly organized by a Chicago gambling syndicate, attempted to compete with Continental after the death of Reagan Sr., but was unsuccessful. In 1947, O'Hara, the United States boss, announced that Trans-American had failed to take over the race news business. O'Hara was quoted by newspapers as saying that Trans-American just ran out of trumps, meaning they ran out of money after sinking $700,000 into the operation. While Trans-American temporarily lured away Continental customers in Kansas City, St. Louis, and New Orleans, the telegraphers eventually returned, and most of the lost customers were recovered. In the seedy underworld of 1949, a sensational story unraveled from the shadowy corners of a Providence cafe, where crime met religion in a jaw-dropping turn of events. Pasquale "Pat" Borino, a humble cook and unlikely whistleblower, peeled back the veil on a $1 million racket that spanned states and shook the foundations of organized crime. At the heart of this twisted tale, Frank Costello, the nation's top racketeer, and a bizarre scheme to run a sweepstakes lottery across state lines, all while plotting even bigger ambitions overseas. With out-of-state cars rolling in, secret meetings in the kitchen, and a racetrack destined for Tel Aviv, this high-stakes game was a masterclass in mob ingenuity. Yet, as local authorities tipped off the crooks, the law was left scrambling, just as Costello's power appeared unstoppable. Out-of-state licenses rolled in. Pasquale "Pat" Borino, a cook at a Providence cafe owned by Raymond Patriarca, the big figure of the Rhode Island underworld, got religion and went to the Providence Journal-Bulletin, where he made an affidavit. He detailed how Frank Costello, the nation's #1 racketeer, and other hoodlums, orchestrated a racket that brought in $1 million a month. Racketeers from several states, led by Costello, met at the cafe in February 1949 to plan a sweepstakes lottery. Tickets were printed in Pawtucket. When the lottery began, Pasquale described 2 visitors to the cafe who held a conference with Patriarca. One of the visitors was Frank Costello, back from New York to check on the progress. The second was a man Pasquale only knew as Poagi, who was later identified as Alfred Poagi Torriello, a Worcester, Massachusetts, representative for Costello. Pasquale didn't know the details of what happened during the meeting, but his role in the lottery was clear. He was tasked with hiding sweepstakes tickets in his kitchen. Big cars with out-of-state licenses arrived at various hours. Men in white hats, with either a scribbled note or a nod from Patriarca, took huge bundles of tickets. A story making the rounds in the underworld concerned one Tony Goebbels, alias Ricci, a lieutenant of the infamous Frank Costello. A large, imposing man in his late 50s with a gangland record that commanded respect, Tony was out tapping the country's racketeers for cash contributions. His goal? To start a racetrack in Tel Aviv, Israel. At first, some of the boys thought it was a polite form of extortion, but Tony insisted that he and his colleagues were genuinely earnest. With thousands of tickets scattered across the eastern states, the Bureau of Investigation began an inquiry. However, before the Bureau of Investigation could act, friendly local police tipped off the gang, preventing authorities from gathering enough evidence to indict the racketeers. Meanwhile, the Costello, Rica, Chicago, and New York axis, already dominating the United States, appeared eager to expand their influence abroad. On March 11, 1950, the Evening World Herald unleashed an explosive exposé from the Providence underworld. In this gripping article, Philip Elwell, the man responsible for connecting New England's bookies to racetracks, claims he's being pushed out by none other than gangsters, and the newspapers themselves. Elwell, caught off guard by a Providence Journal-Bulletin reporter, shares his heated defense. From allegations of rackets to covert wire services linking thousands of bookmakers across Rhode Island, Elwell denies everything, while naming notorious mobsters like Raymond Patriarca. This is one of the articles on gambling by a syndicate of 15 metropolitan newspapers across the nation. Boston, Massachusetts. Philip Elwell, the man whose wire service links New England bookies to the racetracks, claims gangsters and newspapers are rapidly squeezing him out of business. A Providence Journal bulletin reporter confronted Mr. Elwell in the corridor leading to his room at the Bradford Hotel and invited him to share his side of the story. Nothing to say, Elwell, a flushed, balding man of about 60, initially appeared indignant, but then reconsidered. He invited the reporter into his small corner room. "I've got nothing to say," Elwell began, pacing the length of his small quarters. "You fellows are the ones saying things about me. You've got me looking like a criminal." The reporter suggested they go over the charges. "Do you run the Daily Sports Digest?" This is a distributor of racing information provided by the Continental Press Service. "Sure." "Are you the New England Wire Service representative?" "I am." "Who owns your wire?" "There are no rackets in our business." "Yes, I know a firm tried to push us out 2 or 3 times, but we're in legitimate business. I service 2 newspapers in this city, 1 wire service, and a couple of radio stations. I have a state Supreme Court decision that proves I'm in legitimate business. I'm like a man selling a deck of cards or a set of dice." Sells service. How do bookmakers manage to get the service? "I don't know. You get the racing service at your newspaper, don't you?" "We don't use it for bookmaking." "I sell service. If you want to buy it, I don't ask any questions. If a guy tells me he's running a book, I don't sell it to him. If they start making laws against the distribution of news, I'll be out of business." "How many places do you sell to?" "If I sell to 1 bookie, he gives it to 11, and 11 give it to 1,100. We get blamed for all of it, but all we get is 1 account. 3,000 bookies in the state. Isn't there wire service in Pawtucket? Look, there are 3,000 bookmakers in Rhode Island, and that's a low figure, and they all get the wire. If I could get bookies in Rhode Island, how do they get it? I'd know better than to tell you they use a telephone from my room. I can't go down to Rhode Island to sell service. They make me feel out of place. I can't light bonfires. I'd get a slug in my back." "Whom are you afraid of?" "Do you know that Raymond Patriarca, reputed head of the Rackets in Rhode Island, tried to stop me from sending the service into West Warwick? He wanted the whole thing." Phone interrupts. "Do you sell to Patriarca?" "I've met him a couple of times." "Where does William H. Ridings get his?" "Ridings has been named as the wire service wholesaler in Pawtucket." "I don't sell to Ridings, but I used to. I used to sell to Jim Butler too, but I don't anymore." At that moment, Elwell's telephone rang. The conversation included mention of 4 telephones. "That was a Lynn councilman trying to get 4 phones, Elwell said, returning to his seat. "He told the phone company he needed them for my service. The company sent a man up there with my man to prove he wasn't lying." "Why numbers?" "I noticed bookies get the service over a loudspeaker." "They don't get our service over a loudspeaker." "A tape?" "I guess so." "Say, why don't you do a story on some of these papers that play up the numbers racket? The numbers racket is the biggest racket in the world." "Do you know how much bookies make?" "No, only 17%. "How about the lottery?" "I couldn't even guess." "Print the stuff." "Do you object to us using any of the information you've given me in this interview?" "Yes, I object to all of it." "You say you're not a criminal. I think we owe it to the public to publish your side of the story. Look, if you went to Patriarca and asked him the questions you've asked me, what would you get?" "I don't know." "You damn well do. I don't care. Go ahead and print the stuff. There's no money in this business anyhow." On April 29, 1950, the Boston Globe shocked readers with a bombshell Senate subcommittee hearing, exposing the dark underbelly of New England's gambling empire. Massachusetts's renowned racket buster, George Fingold, pulled no punches as he named 3 key players: Philip Elwell, Raymond Patriarca, and Dr. Jasper Sagansky. This powerful trio, controlling gambling from Boston to Providence, were caught in a fierce power struggle for the lucrative West Warwick, Rhode Island territory. Fingold's testimony ripped apart any claims of legitimacy, pointing to Patriarca's ruthless grip on Rhode Island and Sagansky's vast mob operation, which once raked in millions. With police complicity and backdoor deals, the region's gambling racket thrived under the radar until now. The names of 3 men, described as top leaders of New England gambling, were presented to a Senate subcommittee today by George Fingold, a noted racket buster from Massachusetts. 2 of the trio, Philip Elwell of Boston and Raymond Patriarca of Providence, a widely known ex-convict, are reportedly at odds over control of gambling in lucrative West Warwick, Rhode Island, according to Fingold. The 3rd man named was Dr. Jasper Sagansky of Brookline, who was released from prison in 1945 after serving a 2.5-year term at Norfolk State Prison Colony for conspiracy in connection with gambling. Fingold, whose past investigations into racketeering led to convictions in Fall River but met with less success in Revere, provided the Senate Commerce Subcommittee with a lengthy recording of Elwell's testimony during a 1948 gambling trial. The former prosecutor testified that, in most cases, we bypassed local police in making gambling investigations. Fingold, appearing at the invitation of Senator Homer Capehart, Republican, Indiana, said Elwell is the Boston agent for Continental Press Service, which distributes race news to bookmakers in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Elwell operates under the name Sports Digest and disseminates news to bookies. Continental Press Service either pays him a salary or commission. In one raid by state police, 25 telephones were found in Elwell's room at a downtown Boston hotel, Fingold stated. Elwell reportedly claimed that he kept no records, but sent everything out. Without race news results, bookmakers would have difficulty operating, Fingold said. Just last month, Fingold said, Elwell was questioned about Rhode Island bookmakers and estimated there were 3,000 in the state. Elwell was quoted as saying he provided race news service to bookies in Woonsocket, Newport, and West Warwick, Rhode Island. He told us that if we sell to one bookie, he gives it to 11 others, and they pass it on to 1,100, Fingold testified. Patriarca, described by Fingold as a vicious ex-convict, had trouble with Elwell over race news distributed in West Warwick. Patriarca didn't want Elwell there because he wanted full control, according to Fingold. Elwell reportedly told investigators that he was afraid of Patriarca. Elwell claimed he was in a legitimate business, Fingold said, but he couldn't explain why he pulled out his machines before a raid. In my opinion, these operations couldn't continue unless the fix was in. Patriarca's 1938 parole from Massachusetts State Prison, after serving only a few months of a 2 to 3 year sentence for armed robbery, led to an investigation that contributed to the impeachment of former governor's councillor Daniel Conkley. A 4th name given to the committee by Fingold was that of Joseph Hoodsey Hotzer, another one-time leading Bay State gambler. Fingold referred to testimony at Hotzer's trial for income tax evasion, where it was revealed that bookies paid protection money to Boston and Somerville police. Regarding Dr. Jasper Sagansky, a graduate of Tufts Dental School and former practicing dentist, Fingold said he was the head of the largest mob in Boston and deposited $1,400,000 in banks in the 12 months before his arrest. The mob's headquarters, located in Charlestown, was across the square from the police station and district court. When Senator Capehart asked if local law enforcement was aware of the mob's activities, Fingold said investigators had photographs of uniformed police standing in the doorway of the mob's headquarters, bowing and saying hello to the great Sagansky as he entered. Fingold added that bookies couldn't operate without police complicity. And also if local law enforcement had done its duty. Capehart interjected. Fingold agreed. According to Fingold, Elwell had 358 race wire outlets in the New England area 3 months ago. When asked by Senator McFarland, Democrat Arizona, if Boston police had helped break up Sagansky's operations, Fingold said, "In most cases, we bypassed local police. We only stepped in when there was a collapse of law enforcement in a county." The recordings provided to the committee by Fingold were made on September 21, 1948, during Elwell's testimony before Judge John McLeod in Chelsea District Court. This occurred during the trial of a Chelsea man in whose home a ticker tape machine had been discovered. Elwell testified that he had ordered the machine installed and leased it from Western Union. Judge McLeod gave him 5 days to produce his records. When the records were produced, they showed Elwell had leased the machine for $18 a month from Western Union and then subleased it to the defendant for $118 a week. The Western Union contract included a clause that allowed the machine to be removed if it was used for illegal purposes. Elwell was not available for comment tonight at the Boston hotel where he resides. However, Dr. Sagansky, speaking from his home at 168 Gardner Road, Brookline, criticized Fingold, who is expected to announce his candidacy for the Republican nomination for Attorney General. "In my estimation, Fingold is nothing but a public office seeker trying to get headlines," Sagansky said. "That's just a bunch of lies, what he said about Charlestown and the police." Sagansky, who had a long criminal record but whose penalties totaled only $400 in fines before his 1945 conviction, completed a 2.5-year sentence in September 1945 for operating what was described as the largest gambling syndicate in the East, which did $30 million in business a year. A former dentist from the Scott Street area, Sagansky is now 51 years old. He met his legal downfall in 1945 at the hands of then Attorney General Robert Bushnell, whose team included Fingold. When Bushnell cracked down, police found a total of $78,000 in securities and a $10,000 insurance policy on the life of former Mayor James Curley in Sagansky's home and an apartment he maintained on Commonwealth Avenue. These were later returned to him. On February 17, 1943, Sagansky was found guilty in Middlesex Criminal Court of conspiracy to bribe Malden aldermen. 3 days later, he began a 2-year sentence. On March 18th, he pleaded guilty in Suffolk Superior Court to conspiracy to violate the lottery law and received a concurrent 2.5 to 3-year sentence. He was released on parole on September 17, 1945. 2 months later, the State Parole Board recommended a pardon for him, but it was never granted. Sagansky currently lives in Brookline with his wife, the former Miss Lena Goldblatt, whom he married in 1947. On May 2, 1950, the Miami Herald blew the lid off one of the most dangerous and lucrative gambling syndicates ever uncovered in New England. In this jaw-dropping exposé by John Strohmeyer, the article details a nationally financed tri-city racket, stretching from Pawtucket to Worcester and Boston, that has an iron grip on nearly every gambling operation in the region. This powerful alliance of bookmakers, underworld financiers, and notorious crime lords like Raymond Patriarca is bound together by a system that guarantees profits, corrupts local authorities, and crushes any opposition. With secret meetings, lay-off bets, and powerful connections to national crime figures like Frank Costello, this syndicate has become a force that even law enforcement hesitates to confront. A nationally financed syndicate with key centers in Pawtucket, Worcester, and Boston controls the gambling rackets in New England. Journal Bulletin reporters, after weeks of interviewing members of the Underworld and examining secret reports of state and federal investigators, have found that this tri-city alliance binds together nearly every horse parlor and lottery operating within or on the fringes of that triangle. It has organized a system of financial backing that assures member bookmakers that they need never go broke. Every regional betting chief is schooled in a plan to cushion his betting losses among his associates all over New England. Whenever regional betting becomes too risky on any particular horse or number combination, the syndicate finds another solution. They send the money to a stable of approved underworld financiers across the country. These financiers accept the surplus money with guaranteed payment. These outside backers include Frank Erickson, Frank Costello's reputed associate in New York, who is the biggest of them all. The syndicate banks heavily on the theory that in unity there is strength, and in wealth there is power. By using a percentage of its receipts to corrupt police and politicians wherever possible, the Combine has secured an unharassed, protected existence for the most part. In Rhode Island, the headquarters for this racket trust is located in an unpretentious cottage at 6 Whipple Street, Pawtucket. This is the home and office of William Ridings, an important figure in Rhode Island rackets, whose prestige is surpassed only by that of his boss, Raymond Patriarca, the chief of this state's racketeers. Every afternoon during a betting day, 3 telephones ring busily at this address. They are listed under the names John Samuel Horton, George Ashcroft, and John Allen, but the city directory shows no men by those names living at 6 Whipple Street. By utilizing these 3 fictitious listings, Ridings not only attends to his duties as the racewire wholesaler for Blackstone Valley, but he also conducts a first-rate layoff business. In gambling parlance, this means he accepts portions of bets from bookies all over the country. In the course of a day, hundreds of $2 bets placed with corner handbooks in Worcester, Boston, Springfield, and many other cities end up with Ridings. State investigators, who for months monitored the telephone calls of important Massachusetts racketeers in 1943, discovered that Ridings was a big player. He still is. Men who listened in on Harry Dock, Jasper Sagansky, the man who went to jail for milking $8 million a year out of the Boston numbers of Rackets, heard him lay off bets several times a day with Ridings before Sagansky got into trouble with the law in 1943. State police, who checked the telephone conversations of Frank Ionei, the Worcester racket chief, also became acquainted with Ridings around that time. Regular telephone calls between John Samuel Horton and Ionei were noted. When state police, under Assistant Attorney General James Farley, finally raided Ionei in the spring of 1943, they seized telephone lists. Right at the top of the sheet were the name and number of Joe Patriarca, brother of Raymond, and just beneath was the telephone number of Horton. These revelations are a matter of confidential police record. Why haven't Massachusetts police turned these findings over to Rhode Island authorities? "We didn't dare," one Bay State investigator said. "We never could quite trust them." During the early history of the syndicate, Ridings shared his layoff position with Raphael Silverstein, who did business from his home at 30 Hazard Avenue, Providence. State police records, still on file, show that Silverstein was called almost daily by Ionei during betting hours in 1943. Lesser figures in Sagansky's outfit also patronized Silverstein, according to records. Silverstein, reportedly out of business for the last few years, is now living in retirement in a Wayland Square apartment. A reporter's attempts to question him recently about his relations with Ionei, Sagansky, and other racketeers were futile. "I'm a sick man," Silverstein complained after denying any tie-ups. "Leave me alone." The general impression in the underworld is that much of the ill health that forced Silverstein's retirement can be attributed to Raymond Patriarca. Silverstein refused to work in the Patriarca closed shop, the story goes, and paid for his resistance by going out of business. Every man with even a little familiarity with the rackets agrees that Patriarca wields the power for the syndicate in Rhode Island. His ascension as chief of the Rackets is the result of a long, muscling campaign following a career of rum-running, hijacking, robbery, and white slavery. Originally from Worcester, Patriarca gave Ionei, the Worcester racket chief, some early guidance. Their first association dates back to the rum-running days when Ionei worked for the Patriarca mob as a Providence Worcester agent. He ran booze between the two cities for 50 cents a gallon and usually hauled about 300 to 400 gallons per trip. Like most racketeers, Ionei graduated from bootlegging to Beano and then to horse betting and the numbers. Patriarca, however, stuck to the more violent sorts of easy money. Shortly after Daniel Coakley, a member of the Governor's Council in Massachusetts in 1940, was impeached for springing Patriarca from a term in the Massachusetts state prison, the former public enemy was treated by his former Confederates as though he had a contagious disease. According to a one-time member of the Worcester mob, Ionei informed Patriarca that he would no longer be welcome in Worcester. Ionei, who was beginning to bid for respectability, wanted no part of the taint associated with his former rum-running partner. Burned over this affront, Patriarca returned to Providence and called a meeting with a few old associates. 1 week later, 4 men burst into an Ionei dice game on Mechanic Street in Worcester. Tony Santello, then and now an Ionei lieutenant, reached into the cash till and handed over $21,000 at gunpoint. 4 days later, the same foursome barged into a conference meeting in the basement of a Worcester barroom, where Ionei, a high city official, and 4 others were present, according to the former member of the Underworld. The men emptied $6,000 from the pockets of the conferees. After that, word began to circulate that Patriarca was out to kidnap Ionei. 2 weeks passed. Then, one night, 4 men forced their way into the collection room of Ionei's gambling trust on Green Street. The raid was made at 7 in the afternoon, about the time Ionei was usually present, to count the day's take. The Worcester racket chief was absent, as he had been warned by gangster reports. However, a Worcester detective and a policeman were standing guard. The 4 men got the drop on them, seized $19,000 from the money bags, and took the policeman's gun, which was later left in a nearby alley. None of these incidents was made a part of the official record by the police, the Underworld informant added. A few days after the last incident, Patriarca was invited to come up to Worcester to talk things over. Relations between Worcester and Providence have been satisfactory ever since. Patriarca then switched his attention to Rhode Island and used similar tactics, with equally good effect, in inducing ridings to play ball on his side. The former public enemy quickly won a major round. A wealthy businessman capitulated soon after and supplied Patriarca with the financial backing he needed to take control of the lottery. From there, he muscled his way into control of the state's access points to the National Racing Wire Service. As Philip Elwell, the wire representative in New England, indicated in an interview several weeks ago, "I'm not getting the business in Rhode Island. If you want the service in that state, you get it from one of Patriarca's men." Frank "Butsy" Morelli, another former public enemy who was charged with shielding witnesses in the New York Election Day shooting in 1946, was long identified as Patriarca's #1 muscle man in his rise to power. He still holds this position. Morelli is on call at 315 Mount Pleasant Avenue, a fine brick home in a residential section of the city. His telephone listing is under his present alias, Frank Carroll, and another telephone comes into his house under the name Carroll's Radio and Refrigeration Repair Service. The city directory does not list a repair firm by this name, nor do any of the City Hall records or the records of incorporated companies at the State House. The relationship between Patriarca and Ionei goes far beyond a mere financial agreement. Ionei's Worcester monopoly is an important terminal in the Tri-City Combine because of its immunity from police interference. Besides pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into the syndicate's reciprocal layoff system, Ionei provides the only safe haven for hot racketeers who require syndicate protection. A racketeer on the lam from Providence, Boston, or any other city is assured of an undisturbed existence in Worcester if he has the approval of the syndicate, according to the former Worcester gangster. "When you say Ionei is a shooting man, we laugh," he remarked. "He doesn't have to do any shooting. If someone comes into town who's hot, he just tells the police to lay him off. If someone comes in who's not wanted, he picks up the phone and tells the cops where to get him." Following a recent Journal Bulletin story about wide-open conditions in Worcester, Everett Merrill, the city's new city manager, ordered a ban on gambling. What effect, if any, this order will have on Ionei's standing with the police department is still undetermined. Ionei also claims to have connections high up in the state administration. This may explain why the bookies in Fitchburg, a subsidiary of Worcester's monopoly, had advance notice of a recent state police raid. Though the Lombardi mob and its alumni lord over the biggest chunk of the rackets, they are, for security reasons, obliged to slice up some of the hub territory. This has tended to spread gambling interests among a half-dozen groups, all of them allied. The whole show in Boston was once run by Doc Sagansky. In 1943, state police and federal authorities ganged up on him in a combined investigation. Among others indicted was Joseph Timilty, Boston's police commissioner. A Boston judge threw out this indictment without stating a reason for his action. Timilty was indicted again, and this time another judge dismissed the indictment on the grounds that the commissioner is under no obligation to suppress gaming houses or lotteries. The investigation didn't cut deeply into the operation of the racket combine. It merely shook up the chain of command. State police, who anticipated a fight for racket leadership, never saw it develop. The Ionei and Patriarca gangs work closely with the Lombardi gang in Boston's North End. This group controls the syndicate's terminal in Boston. The old crew, Harry and Nathan Goodsnyder, brothers-in-law of Sagansky, got light jail terms and emerged with reduced shares of the rackets, as did James and Richard Harkins and Harry Portnoy. The financial figures behind the syndicate, who did their business from legitimate offices, were relatively undisturbed. However, according to men close to the underworld, Phil Bucola, a cunning Sicilian, outpaced the competition with considerable interference provided by the Lombardi gang. Bucola had long been biding his time for just such an opening. Trained in Brooklyn, he was sent to Boston to look out for interests in 1922. Since then, he has often been arrested by police, but there is no record of a conviction. For years, Bucola attempted to corner the fight-promoting business in Boston, using money raised from his racket interests in the North End. During this time, he maintained a close relationship with Raymond Patriarca and was intimate enough with Ionei to rate a place on his private telephone list, which the police seized. Bucola has already started throwing his newfound weight around. Fortified with money put up by the syndicate, he came to Providence in 1948 and attempted to take over the boxing concession. Dropping in unexpectedly upon Manny Almeida, the Providence fight promoter, Bucola announced that he had $50,000 to fight Almeida if he didn't agree to a working arrangement. Almeida ordered him out of his taproom, but Bucola left a parting message. "I'll be seeing you." Ironically, a well-intentioned gentleman dropped into Almeida's fight and gave the Providence chief some sound advice. "Don't get worried, Manny," he advised. "Just contact Raymond Patriarca. He'll straighten things out." Almeida has had police protection on fight nights ever since Bucola's visit. The threat of the syndicate muscling into control of the New England fight game still exists. Boxing is just one of the legitimate businesses where syndicate money has been used to gain control. A significant share of the proceeds is already invested in nightclubs, hotel chains, and racetracks. Large sums of money also find their way into political campaigns. Even veteran police investigators are unable to estimate how much business is transacted each day over the telephone wires between Pawtucket, Worcester, Boston, and numerous subsidiary cities. They also hesitate to guess how much money is sent to figures in the national syndicate in New York and other parts of the country. However, something is known about the individuals in the national setup, and they will be the subject of another article. On July 2nd, 1950, the Boston Globe revealed a major escalation in the battle against organized crime, as the United States Senate Crime Investigating Committee, led by Senator Kefauver, rallied every police department in New England to aid in its probe of interstate criminal operations. Letters flooded police chiefs across the region, calling for intelligence on notorious figures like Raymond Patriarca, Philip Buchla, and Frank Ionei, men already on the committee's radar for their alleged stranglehold on gambling and racketeering. With Boston Police Commissioner Thomas Sullivan swiftly mobilizing his forces, this investigation is set to uncover the dark web of interstate crime, where gambling, narcotics, and corruption rule. The Kefauver Committee is on the hunt, determined to expose the secrets of the underworld and its connections to crooked law enforcement. The Special United States Senate Crime Investigating Committee enlisted the services of every police department in New England yesterday in its probe of organized crime in interstate commerce. Letters requesting information on the operations of criminals and racketeers were sent to police chiefs in all cities and towns, as well as to the heads of the 6 state police organizations. The letters were signed by Senator Estes Kefauver, Democrat of Tennessee, chairman of the committee. Boston Police Commissioner Thomas Sullivan immediately ordered copies of the letter he received to be sent to the captains of all divisions and units within the department. He requested these officers to forward to him any information that may prove useful to the committee. Sullivan will then send all the data he collects to Washington. Several weeks ago, Kefauver named 3 New England men whose alleged gambling activities his group plans to investigate. The 3 named are Raymond Patriarca of Providence, Philip Buchla of Boston, and Frank Ionei of Worcester. At that time, he said that the names of these men were among those of alleged gamblers and racketeers on a list in possession of the committee. He added that the committee already has a report on gambling and racketeering in New England, compiled from information received from the Massachusetts Citizens Committee, individuals, government officials, and newspapers. In his letter to New England police officials yesterday, Kefauver stated that his group aims to gather as much information as possible concerning the operations of organized criminals and racketeers in every portion of the country. By compiling and cross-referencing this information, he explained, the committee hopes to discover leads that might not be obtained in investigations confined to particular areas alone. He emphasized that the committee is particularly interested in activities involving the use of interstate communication facilities, the investment of money, whether in legitimate or illegitimate enterprises, that was illegally obtained in other areas, and in crimes that show evidence of interstate activity. In addition, he said, we are, of course, interested in violations of narcotics, counterfeiting, and other federal laws. Where there is evidence that such criminals are protected through the connivance of law enforcement officers or other public officials, the committee will welcome your advice. On November 1st, 1951, the Boston Globe reported that the U.S. Internal Revenue Department had filed tax liens totaling $381,031.23 against the assets of Worcester gambling boss Frank Ionei. Ionei, a prominent figure named in both the Kefauver and Senadella Kelly crime investigations, was reportedly either out of the country or in Florida at the time, and no immediate action had been taken against his property. The liens, which cover alleged unpaid taxes from 1948 to 1950, were filed in both Suffolk and Worcester counties. But Ionei's real estate holdings remain elusive, with only modest properties linked to his wife, Mary. Ionei, once described by a district judge as the man who controlled the gambling racket in Worcester, continues to evade direct local legal action despite his reputation as a significant political and criminal influence in the region. Tax liens totaling $381,031.23 against the assets of Worcester gambling boss Frank Ionei were filed yesterday by the United States Internal Revenue Department. However, the big-time gambler, named in both the Kefauver and Senadella Kelly probes, was said to be either abroad or in Florida, and there was no evidence last night that the tax liens had yet resulted in any actual levy on his property. The liens were filed in both Suffolk and Worcester counties, in anticipation of action to recover additional income taxes allegedly due. The government claims Ionei owes $99,457.81 more for 1948, $127,810.41 for 1948, $1,949, and $153,763.01 for 1950. However, assessors' records in Worcester, Boston, Revere, and Chelsea disclosed no real estate owned by Ionei. The liens, according to Acting Collector of Internal Revenue Albert Hughes, are good against almost any kind of assets, including cash in the bank, if any exists. The liens do not apply to any property owned by Ionei's wife, Mary, who owns several small parcels of property in Worcester, with a total value of less than $20,000. These include the Ionei home, a modest bungalow at 21 Berkeley Street, Worcester. It was also learned last night that no lien has been filed affecting the Ionei summer home at Misquamicut, Rhode Island. Ionei, 58 years old, had been named by Senator Estes Kefauver, chairman of the Senate Crime Committee, as one of 3 New Englanders his committee planned to investigate if time allowed. The committee expired before that could happen. Around that time, Ionei, whose name had been linked with that of gangster Raymond Patriarca in Rhode Island, left Worcester, and some reports placed him abroad. However, District Attorney Alfred Senadella stated that Ionei went to Florida and has been there since. He was not home yesterday when tax officials paid a visit. During the Senadella-Derham-Kelly investigation, District Judge John Derham of Uxbridge remarked about Ionei. Every schoolboy in Worcester knew he controlled the gambling racket. State records list Ionei as president of the Central Wholesale Grocers Incorporated, and he is said to have an interest in a Worcester liquor store managed by his son at 129 Shrewsbury Street. In 1943, state police arrested him in a Worcester gambling raid, and he was fined $5,000 and given a 2-year suspended sentence for setting up and promoting a lottery. In Worcester, where local police have never arrested him, he is known as a powerful political influence. On February 14, 1953, the Miami News reported that federal authorities are facing obstacles in their pursuit of Frank Ionei, a reputed Worcester gambling czar, over tax evasion charges. Police informed officials that Ionei has been absent from the city for 2 years, possibly residing in Italy or Florida. Indicted by a federal grand jury, Ionei is accused of evading $27,875 in income taxes between 1947 and 1951. But his elusive whereabouts have thwarted Treasury Department agents' efforts to bring him to justice. Ionei was previously identified as the top figure in Worcester's gambling operations during testimony before the Kefauver Crime Investigating Committee, where his connections to Rhode Island gambling kingpin Raymond Patriarca were also highlighted. Federal authorities, seeking a reputed Worcester gambling czar on tax evasion charges, were notified by police today that he has been out of the city for 2 years and is believed to be either in Italy or Florida. The whereabouts of Frank Ionei, indicted yesterday by the federal grand jury, remain a mystery, thwarting plans by Treasury Department agents to arraign him on charges of evading payment of $27,875 in income taxes from 1947 through 1951. Ionei was named in testimony before the Kiefer Crime Investigating Committee as the top man in Worcester gambling. The testimony was provided by Virgil Peterson, director of the Chicago Crime Commission and former agent in charge of the Boston FBI office. Peterson told the committee that Ionei was once associated with Raymond Patriarca, whom he identified as the kingpin of Rhode Island gambling. On March 25, 1953, the Morning Union reported the arrest of notorious Boston jewelry thief Benjamin F. Tilley in Miami, Florida, in connection with a $158,300 gem robbery. Tilley, 43, was apprehended alongside Alfred Corey, and both men now face multiple charges, including armed robbery and grand larceny. Tilley, whose criminal career dates back to 1919, made headlines for a spectacular 1937 arrest at Boston's City Hall, where he was cornered after a downtown chase with none other than Raymond Patriarca, the infamous Providence gangster. The duo had been plotting to rob a jewelry salesman of over $100,000 in gems, but their plan was thwarted by sharp-eyed police officers. Despite his extensive criminal record, Tilley has largely evaded conviction, making this latest arrest a significant moment in his checkered history of jewelry heists and run-ins with the law. Tilley nabbed in Miami gem theft, once involved in spectacular pursuit in Boston. The Boston Bandit is cornered in City Hall battle in 1937. After Pal, Raymond Patriarca was caught. Benjamin F. Tilley, 43, of Boston, a well-known jewelry robber who was arrested in a spectacular fashion in City Hall in 1937, has been arrested in Miami, Florida, along with a companion in connection with a $158,300 jewelry robbery there last Tuesday. Union Station theft unsolved. Arrested with Tilley in Miami was Alfred Corey, 40, also of Boston. The two men are currently held on a variety of charges, including suspicion of armed robbery in connection with the gem theft, suspicion of grand larceny in the theft of $1,500 worth of furs, and disorderly conduct for being known criminals. Police took particular note of their arrest, as the gem theft from Union Station in Boston remains unsolved, and Tilley was not averse to the Springfield area. In 1937, Tilley was arrested inside City Hall after a downtown chase and a scuffle outside the office of the city treasurer. At that time, he was traveling under the alias William Philbin and was in the company of Raymond Patriarca of Providence, who was known as a notorious gangster to police throughout the area. Patriarca and Tilley were said to have followed a jewelry salesman to the city with the intent to ambush him and relieve him of more than $100,000 worth of jewels he was carrying. Tilley was wanted in Fall River on charges of assault and robbery. Although he later beat that charge, 9 months later he was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in state prison for a $5,000 armed robbery at a Brookline store. Extensive criminal record police say Tilley has more than 40 charges against his name, most of them related to jewelry thefts. However, due to his cunning ability, he has managed to avoid conviction on all but a few of the charges. His criminal record dates back to 1919. In 1937, Tilley and Patriarca were shadowing jewelry salesman David Abrahamson of Boston, who was carrying a fortune in gems. They were spotted by employees of the John Lynch store at 272 Bridge Street, and the police were notified. Officer Thomas Kelleher and Captain John Crowley, then a lieutenant, spotted the men in a car at the corner of Pinchon Street. However, as the two officers attempted to take the men into custody, Tilley broke away and ran west on Pinchon Street. Officer Kelleher gave chase, but Tilley proved to be the faster runner. He dashed inside City Hall, where he was eventually spotted by Lieutenant Patrick Kenton, who is now retired. Tilley was cornered near the treasurer's office. A fierce battle ensued, and there was editorial criticism at the time, noting that none of the City Hall employees went to aid the embattled officer. Tilly was finally apprehended, and rumours swept through the city that the Treasurer's office had been robbed. Patriarca was placed under arrest by Captain Crowley, and Tilly was finally subdued by Captain James Collins, then a patrolman in the Detective Bureau. Shortly after the arrest of the two men, John Cavici of Roxbury went to police headquarters and requested to see Tilly. Cavici's visit aroused the suspicions of Sergeant Charles Murphy, now a lieutenant, and a quick background check revealed that Cavici, a friend of Tilly's, was wanted in Boston for jumping bail and failing to appear in court on charges of assault with intent to kill and carrying a concealed weapon. Tilly was handed over to Fall River authorities, and although he beat that charge, the armed robbery charge, later that same year, resulted in one of his few prison terms. On October 9, 1953, the Morning Union reported that Benjamin Tilly, a notorious figure in Boston's criminal underworld, was once again in police custody, this time on the relatively minor charge of registering bets. Tilly, 43, had previously been linked to infamous crimes such as the Brinks and Sturtevant hold-ups, but was arrested today at his mother's Roxbury home with 107 horse bet slips and a diary listing prominent figures in Boston sporting circles. Known for his dramatic 1937 arrest after a chase through City Hall alongside Rhode Island gangster Raymond Patriarca, Tilly's latest brush with the law adds to a long history of criminal activity, though today's charges are far less severe. Benjamin Tilly, 43, whose reputation is such that he is often the first person questioned by police following a major hold-up, was arrested today on the comparatively minor charge of registering bets. Tilly, who had been questioned in connection with the infamous Brinks and Sturtevant hold-ups, was apprehended at his mother's home in Roxbury. Police Captain John Cunniffe said his raiders found 107 horse bet slips and a diary containing the names of men and women prominent in Boston sporting circles. In 1937, Tilly was arrested following a dramatic pursuit inside City Hall. At the time, he was traveling under the alias William Philbin and was accompanied by Raymond Patriarca of Providence. After a chase involving several officers, Tilly was finally subdued and taken into custody by Captain James Collins, who was then a patrolman in the Detective Bureau. The scuffle and arrest took place just outside the office of the city treasurer. Raymond Dion of 23 Cross Street, Ludlow, told police last night that the roof of his convertible was slashed, and the glove compartment was forced open sometime between 7:30 in the afternoon and 11 at night on Lyman Street, between Spring and Chestnut Streets. He reported that a $10 raincoat and a pair of sunglasses were stolen. On February 26, 1954, the Morning Union reported that Raymond Patriarca, the reputed leader of Rhode Island's underworld, was hit with 2 federal tax liens totaling $58,666.26. These liens, covering unpaid income taxes from 1945 to 1951, mark the first public sign of an extensive U.S. Treasury investigation into Patriarca's finances that had been underway for over 2 years. One lien for $65,132.40 targets Patriarca alone for taxes owed from 1945 to 1947, while the second, for $21,532.86, includes his wife, Helen Patriarca, for the years 1948 to 1951. This development adds another chapter to Patriarca's long history of criminal investigations, as federal authorities intensify their scrutiny of one of New England's most notorious figures. Raymond Patriarca, reputed leader of the Rhode Island underworld, was hit today with 2 liens covering unpaid federal income taxes, amounting, with penalties and interest, to $58,666.26 for the years from 1945 to 1951. The liens, filed at City Hall, represent the first public indication of an intensive U.S. Treasury investigation that started against the state's most well-known racketeer more than 2 years ago, according to the Providence Journal Bulletin. One lien for $65,132.40 is against Patriarca alone for the period from 1945 to 1947. The second lien for $21,532.86 is against Patriarca and his wife, Helen Patriarca, for the period from 1948 to 1951. While operating a steel company in New York, Sullivan pleaded innocent to 2 indictments and was released on $5,000 bail. The first indictment charges that the Berkshire Steel Company, along with Sullivan as its president, evaded taxes in 1947, amounting to $10,345.32. The second indictment has 2 counts, both against Sullivan personally. One charge is that he evaded taxes amounting to $49,026.55 in 1947, and the other alleges unpaid taxes of $34,400.50 in 1947, $144.72 in 1948. According to the Providence Journal Bulletin, Sullivan fought prosecution in the tax case with at least 6 different sets of attorneys. When the investigation began about 2 years ago, he hired Joseph Noonan, Jr., former Commissioner of Internal Revenue under the Democratic administration. Noonan is now under indictment for dodging taxes on his own returns. After the Republican administration took office, Sullivan retained, among others, Robert Bradford, former Republican governor of Massachusetts, the Journal Bulletin reported. Sullivan first attracted attention in Rhode Island in 1946, when he emerged as one of the 2 major contributors to the successful Senate campaign of Howard McGrath. He gave McGrath $5,000, the maximum amount permitted under election laws. Earlier, Sullivan had successfully bid on a number of Quonset war contracts, according to investigations by the Navy, the newspaper said. On December 29, 1954, the Boston Globe reported that 4 men from the Greater Boston area, including relatives of key figures tied to the infamous Brinks robbery, refused to cooperate with the Massachusetts Crime Commission's ongoing investigation. Vincent Costa, Richard Cunningham, Walter Bennett, and Louis Venios invoked their right against self-incrimination, or provided evasive answers during questioning, particularly regarding gambling operations and potential connections to stolen money. The men had ties to Anthony Pino, a witness in the Brinks case who is facing deportation, and others linked to the unsolved $1.2 million heist from 5 years earlier. The Crime Commission has hinted at revelations that could result in prison sentences for several individuals, though it remains tight-lipped about specific details. 4. Greater Boston men have refused to answer pertinent questions asked by the Massachusetts Crime Commission. 3 of the men who appeared before the commission yesterday were identified as relatives of witnesses in the federal grand jury investigation into the unsolved $1,219,000 Brinks robbery from 5 years ago. 2 of the men were Vincent Costa, 40, of Boston, and Richard Cunningham, 33, of Quincy. Costa is a brother-in-law, and Cunningham a son-in-law of Anthony Pino, a Brinks witness who is under a federal deportation order to Italy. A 3rd witness yesterday was Walter Bennett, 42, of Norwell, whose brother Edward had been cited and later cleared of contempt for refusing to answer questions asked by the Brinks grand jury. The 4th reluctant witness before the Crime Commission was Louis Venios, 42, of Woburn. Costa invoked the 12th article of the state constitution against self-incrimination more than 30 times in refusing to answer questions related to gambling operations. Cunningham was asked if he knew whether payoffs were made or prizes given in lotteries with stolen money. At first, he declined to answer, but then said, "I don't know nothing about that stuff. Payoffs, stolen money, or whatever you're talking about." Bennett refused to state his current occupation, but admitted that his occupation in Attleboro in 1949 was just a little dice game. He accused the commission of asking silly questions and asserted he wasn't trying to be fresh, adding, "I just went to school for 7 years and can't match wits with college graduates." Venios denied having any financial interest in a Boston liquor establishment. He also declined to state his present occupation and blurted out, "You guys are asking me too many questions. I may lose my job." Commission counsel Thomas McCardle asked Venios if he knew Raymond Patriarca of Providence, a former convict. Venios responded, "I don't know him, even if he was you." The Boston Post reported today that the Crime Commission has disclosures which are expected to send at least 7 persons to prison in connection with the Brinks robbery. The Commission, however, refused to comment. On March 4, 1956, the Miami Herald published the first in a series of investigative articles by Lawrence Thompson, shedding light on the growing presence of mobsters in Greater Miami. Once notorious for their roles in organized crime, many of these figures are now quietly settling into the area, raising concerns that the Mafia may be establishing a new headquarters in the region. While some of these individuals appear to be living innocuously, Thompson's investigation suggests otherwise. Among the notable figures residing in Miami Beach is Gaetano Ricci, also known as Tony Ricci, who was once listed by Chicago police as a top member of the Mafia. Joining him is Freddie DeFelice, also known as Freddie Franco, a former Brooklyn operator now associated with legitimate-looking businesses in Miami, along with Frank Diaguardi, a notorious figure from New York's Garment District. Not to be forgotten is Frank Iacone, well known in Worcester, Massachusetts, for his ties to the infamous Raymond Patriarca and Frank Costello. Authorities like Dan Sullivan of the Greater Miami Crime Commission and local law enforcement are well aware of their presence, suspecting that these former mobsters are not merely sunbathing, but may still be connected to criminal activities. With more revelations to come, Miami's mobbed-up underworld is starting to come into focus. Shades of Mafia. Are mobsters in Miami to sun or sin? By Lawrence Thompson. Herald staff writer. Lawrence Thompson, one of the Herald's top reporters, has spent weeks investigating the whereabouts and activities of nationally known hoodlums in our midst. This is the first of several articles on the subject. Greater Miami has become home to some of the mobsters from the days when gangs considered themselves above the government. And there are signs that the Mafia may be making this one of its major headquarters. Many of these hoodlums have lived here for years, and their former associates are joining them in increasing numbers. Some do nothing more than live or visit here. If they are continuing the trades that made them rich and notorious in the bad old days, they are covering it up well. But they're here, and it's a pretty good guess that most of them aren't here for their health. If the old S&G Syndicate, the group that once controlled bookmaking and allied illegal pursuits on Miami Beach, were ever revived, there would be different names on the power list. Most people would be surprised to know that the behind-the-scenes owners of some plush night spots are men who used to be better known as hoodlums than as businessmen. Many guests at the swank hotels or owners of lavish homes used to be in the same category. Do you think we're kidding? Back in 1950, Captain William Drury of the Chicago Police Department wrote a story about the Mafia. One of the men he mentioned as a top member of the outfit was Gaetano Ricci, also known as Anthony Ricci, or Tony. Well, Mr. Tony Ricci, now 63, moved here from Brooklyn some time ago. His local address is reported to be the Ocean Creek Apartments, 5980 Indian Creek Drive, Miami Beach. Consider another year-round resident, Freddie DeFelice, better known to some people as Freddie Franco, and also known as Alfred George Felice. He used to operate in Brooklyn, where he has a criminal record. But to many locals and visitors, he is best known as one of the owners of a swank nightclub and restaurant. In fact, Mr. Franco is reportedly associated in some ventures with one Frank Diaguardi, better known as Frankie Dio, who earned quite a reputation in the good old days as one of the notorious Dio brothers in New York's garment district. He's part of our community now, and in some legitimate-looking businesses too. Visit one of our swankiest hotels, and you may see Irving Niggy Devine, who is much better known in Cincinnati. Niggy has returned to be among us after some time away, and he enjoys visiting the Eden Rock card room. Another former resident who has returned to share our sunshine is Frank Iaconi. His name may not mean much to his fellow sun lovers, but it certainly does back in Worcester, Massachusetts. They know him well in Rhode Island too, where his name is often associated with that of Raymond Patriarca, or even in New York, where he is mentioned alongside Frank Costello. There are others. We will tell you more about them in future articles. The Mafia alumni have always liked Miami Beach and its surrounding areas, as have members of other gangs. Representatives from most of the old gangs now call this place home. However, suspected Mafia members seem to predominate. We all know they're here, says Dan Sullivan, operating director of the Crime Commission of Greater Miami. Sure, they're coming down here, says a retired New York detective. I see them every day. But they just have a loose organization, a local kind of operation, not like the old Mafia. Loosely knit? Asks Detective Lieutenant Bruce Simmons of the Miami Beach Police. I wouldn't say it's loosely knit. They are here, and they must have meetings. We had a report recently about one of their meetings, but we couldn't get anything on it. But we're sure they get together. Wherever you have Italian gangsters, you have the Mafia, says Lieutenant Robert Thompson of the Beach Police Force. We've heard they were coming here. We'll tell you more about your neighbors in later stories. On June 19, 1956, the Boston Globe reported that Giuseppe Joe Dinarello of East Boston, identified by the Massachusetts Crime Commission as one of the top figures in organized gambling in Winthrop, refused to answer questions during the Commission's public hearings. Dinarello, along with 21 other witnesses, appeared before the Commission but invoked the 12th article of the Massachusetts Constitution to avoid answering, accusing the Commission of seeking publicity. Commission counsel Thomas McCardle questioned Dinarello about past convictions and his involvement in gambling operations, including allegations that he offered bribes to the Winthrop Police Department. Dinarello declined to respond to questions about his ties to Rhode Island crime boss Raymond Patriarca. His attorney, Paul Smith, assured the court that the witnesses' rights were protected. Despite his refusal to cooperate, the Commission continued to probe into illegal gambling in Massachusetts. Giuseppe Joe Dinarello of East Boston, described by the Massachusetts Crime Commission as one of the 3 moving figures in organized gambling in Winthrop, today refused to answer the Commission's questions and accused it of seeking newspaper publicity. Dinarello, one of 21 witnesses ordered by the court to appear at the 3rd day of public hearings by the Commission, made his accusation when Commission counsel Thomas McCardle asked if he had once been convicted of a liquor violation. "What bearing does a liquor violation have on why you called me here?" Dinarello shot back. "I refuse to answer under the 12th article of the Massachusetts Constitution. That question is unconstitutional. You are only doing this for a newspaper stand." This prompted Chairman Charles C. Cabot to respond, "The more people who read about you, the better I like it." Dinarello declined to say whether his refusal to answer questions meant he was claiming the privilege against self-incrimination. Among the other questions he refused to answer were, "Are you one of the 3 main moving figures behind gambling in Winthrop? Did you make any arrangements regarding arrests? Did you offer to leave an envelope every week for a member of the Winthrop Police Department?" Dinarello also refused to say whether he knew Raymond Patriarca of Rhode Island, who was once at the center of a pardon controversy in Massachusetts. After Dinarello left the stand, Frank Christopher of Winthrop was called. He declined to say whether or not he was employed by Dinarello. Dinarello was asked if he had been conducting a bookmaking operation at 46 Main Street in Winthrop, and whether he had any interest in gaming operations at 229 Main Street in the same town. He refused to answer in both instances. Attorney Paul Smith, representing Dinarello and several other reluctant witnesses, stated that he had been assured by Judge Horace T. Cahill that the witnesses' rights would not be waived by their response to summonses to appear before the Commission. On June 19, 1956, the Boston Globe reported that Giuseppe, Joe, Dinarello of East Boston, identified by the Massachusetts Crime Commission as one of the key figures in organized gambling in Winthrop, refused to cooperate with the Commission's inquiry. During the third day of public hearings, Dinarello not only declined to answer questions, but also accused the Commission of seeking publicity through the newspapers. He invoked the 12th article of the Massachusetts Constitution to avoid answering questions about his involvement in gambling and alleged connections with law enforcement, including whether he offered bribes to Winthrop police. Dinarello further refused to comment on any ties to notorious Rhode Island mobster Raymond Patriarca. His defiance, along with other witnesses like Frank Costello, highlighted the ongoing struggle the Commission faces in probing organized crime in Massachusetts. The Senate Rackets Committee was set today to investigate the nation's multi-billion-dollar coin-operated machine industry, with a particular focus on any racketeer infiltration into labor and management within the industry. In preparation for what could be sensational new hearings starting Thursday, the committee revealed that it has subpoenaed about 100 witnesses, including some of the nation's top hoodlums, for questioning. Committee Chairman John McClellan, Democrat of Arkansas, said the initial testimony would concern at least 7 states: New York, Florida, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, California, and Indiana. Other witnesses have been subpoenaed from Colorado, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Louisiana. Among those summoned are participants in the notorious Gangland meeting in Appalachian, New York, on November 14, 1957, which was broken up by police. McClellan stated that the new hearings would explore the extent of racketeer inroads into both labor unions and management in this field. He explained, "The focal point of the investigation will be an attempt to determine whether or not labor unions in this field have been formed and operated for legitimate union aims, or whether, in many cases, they have been formed as an adjunct to and enforcement arm for management, acting in collusion to allegedly monopolize the industry." The senator, who estimated that the hearings would last about 4 weeks, said the investigation is the result of more than a year's work by committee investigators. He noted that there are more than 500,000 jukeboxes in commercial operation in the United States today. In addition to these and other coin-operated amusement devices, the industry distributes more than $2 billion worth of goods and services annually. Seek racketeer infiltration. We are endeavoring to discover the extent of racketeer infiltration into this multi-billion-dollar industry, McClellan said. The witness list includes Gerardo Catina from Newark, New Jersey, Joseph Massey and Joseph Indelicato, both of Miami, Florida, Frank Camerata of Youngstown, Ohio, Harold Sherry from Los Angeles, California, Harry Friedman from Cleveland, Ohio, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, Louisiana, Raymond Patriarca of Providence, Rhode Island, Joseph Saladino of Denver, Colorado, and Fred Seeker of Los Angeles, California. The subcommittee has been closely monitoring some 65 gangland figures who attended the Appalachian meeting since New York State Police raided the session, sending some of the delegates scampering into the nearby woods. On February 7, 1960, the Boston Globe revealed startling details about a Little Appalachian meeting held by the gambling bosses of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut in Worcester on December 8, 1959. Attorney General Edward McCormick, Jr. charged that between 100 and 200 underworld figures gathered at a restaurant owned by 2 racketeers, with 25 to 30 of them, considered the hierarchy of illegal gambling, meeting later in a downtown hotel to plan future operations. The meeting came to light during the investigation into the murder of Hartford racketeer Gaetano Little Sir Echo Di Nicola, whose fate authorities believe was decided during this Underworld conference. A Little Appalachian meeting held by New England gambling bosses. 2 weeks after the meeting, Di Nicola was found dead, shot execution style behind a Framingham motel. The probe has expanded into Rhode Island and Connecticut, with key figures like Raymond Patriarca, the alleged gambling overlord of Rhode Island, admitting his presence at the hotel meeting. Authorities believe the gathering mirrored the infamous Appalachian meeting of 1957, where mob leaders from across the country were arrested, leading to major conspiracy charges. Investigators are now following leads across state lines as they work to unravel the connections behind Di Nicola's murder and ongoing gambling rackets in New England. A Little Appalachian meeting was held by the gambling bosses of Massachusetts, Rhode Island and Connecticut in Worcester on December 8th. Attorney General Edward J. McCormick Jr. charged last night. The gangland conference was uncovered by investigators looking into the murder of Hartford, Connecticut, racketeer Gaetano, Little Sir Echo, Di Nicola, McCormick said. Between 100 and 200 Underworld figures were in Worcester that night, at a restaurant owned by 2 racketeers, according to McCormick. After the gathering, 25 to 30 of them, comprising the hierarchy of illegal gambling, went to a downtown hotel room where they spent the early morning hours planning future operations. 2 weeks later, Di Nicola was found dead behind a Framingham motel, shot 3 times in the back of the head. Several of the men in the hotel room were from Boston, McCormick said, while the rest were from the western part of Massachusetts, Rhode Island and Connecticut. Raymond Patriarca, alleged overlord of gambling in Rhode Island, admitted under questioning in the ongoing probe that he was present in the hotel room. Patriarca's statement to Rhode Island Attorney General J. Joseph Nugent confirmed law enforcement suspicions of a high-level crime meeting. In Worcester, Deputy Police Chief P. Frank Carroll, head of the Detective Division, said his men were following several leads and that he expected to confer with state officials sometime this week. Assistant Attorney General Joseph Doyle, coordinating the investigation in Middlesex, Worcester, and Hampton, Berkshire counties, said 2 weeks ago that reports of a Little Appalachian meeting were being checked. Di Nicola's fate. Decided. Authorities believe that Di Nicola's fate was a key topic of discussion at the meeting. The Hartford gambling figure was reportedly marked for death after pocketing $10,000 to $12,000 of payoff money from a Mafia-controlled gambling operation. Of the men questioned so far, only Patriarca admitted being at the hotel, according to Attorney General Nugent. He told us that he knew Di Nicola only slightly, Nugent said. Patriarca and Underworld enforcer John Nazarian of Providence were both questioned by Rhode Island authorities for more than 5 hours. Nazarian denied any knowledge of the meeting or Di Nicola's murder. Link to Appalachian. Meeting? McCormick said the investigation would mirror the conspiracy charges stemming from the notorious Appalachian meeting on November 14, 1957. At that meeting, 20 men were arrested and later sentenced to a total of 94 years in jail, with fines amounting to $130,000. They remain free pending appeal. According to McCormick, all of the men present at the Worcester meeting were known gamblers and held high-ranking positions in the underworld. Authorities believe that representatives from New York and New Jersey may have also attended to discuss territorial boundaries. A list containing 32 names, believed to be delegates to the Worcester meeting, was found in Di Nicola's pocket when his body was discovered. Included were the names of Patriarca and Kazarian. We know Di Nicola was at the restaurant that night along with other gamblers from Hartford, McCormick said. However, whether he was at the hotel meeting has not yet been determined. Second break in investigation. The De Nicola Conference was the second major break in an ongoing investigation into New England gambling operations. The first break occurred when authorities raided a large betting ring in West Springfield. 2 men were arrested, and authorities discovered that it was a major operation connected to larger gambling syndicates. The ever-widening murder probe has crossed state lines into Rhode Island and Connecticut. De Nicola had transferred his activities from Worcester to Hartford several years ago. State Police Lieutenant Cornelius J. Crowley, assigned to Middlesex County District Attorney John Droney's office, heads the De Nicola investigation. De Nicola's murder is one of several linked to underworld violence, including Michael Mandelia Jr., 32, who was shot 10 times on September 17, 1957, and Dominic Rocky Valente, 34, who was shot 5 times on January 20, 1957.